He didn't even look up when she walked in. Clayton Hurst, the wealthiest cattle baron in the whole Bitterroot Valley, sat spread across two chairs at the train station's only bench like he owned the building itself, which, as it happened, he nearly did. He had his boots propped on a traveling trunk that didn't belong to him, a cigar burning slow between two fingers, and when the eastbound train finally groaned to a stop on the snow-packed platform, he just smiled to himself, the kind of smile a man wears when he already knows how the story ends. He'd been waiting, not for the train, for the woman on it. And when Silas Boone, weathered, quiet, hat pulled low against the December wind, stepped forward to meet his mail-order bride, Clayton leaned over to the man beside him and said, loudly enough for half the platform to hear, "Poor fool's gonna take one look at her and realize God made a mistake putting her on his train." Laughter. Actual laughter, from men who should have known better. Silas heard every word. He always did. If you've ever felt like the world decided who you were before you had a chance to prove otherwise, stay with this story. Because what happened next on that frozen Montana platform didn't just change one man's life. It changed what an entire valley believed was possible. And before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I want you along for every chapter. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that platform. Silas Boone had driven his wagon 14 miles in the cold to reach Harlan Creek's train station, and the whole drive he'd been rehearsing what to say. He'd written the words down once, on the back of a feed receipt, then thrown it in the fire because writing them made him feel ridiculous. A 41-year-old man practicing introductions like a schoolboy. He told himself he wasn't nervous. He was just prepared. That was different, except his hands had been tight on the reins the whole way, and he'd checked the station clock 3 times in the first 5 minutes of arriving, which wasn't like him. Silas wasn't a clock-checking man. He was a man who read the sky and trusted it. He'd started writing to Adeline Rhodes 7 months ago, after his neighbor, Ruth Calloway, had pushed the correspondence agency's pamphlet across his kitchen table with the firm insistence of a woman who had decided something on his behalf. He'd refused politely. Ruth had left the pamphlet anyway. It sat on his table for 2 weeks before he read it, and then another 2 weeks passed before he wrote a single line. He hadn't described himself kindly in that first letter because he didn't think lying to a stranger served either of them. He was 41. His face had been working outdoors since he was 16 and looked it. His ranch, the Boone Spread, 112 acres on the western slope, was functional but not pretty. He had a dog named Cobb, a decent herd, and a root cellar that flooded every spring. He was not a man who laughed easily or talked much in groups. He had no family left in Montana and no close friends except maybe Ruth, who would have argued the maybe. He sent the letter expecting nothing. Adeline wrote back in 11 days. Her letter was 2 pages, front and back, written in handwriting that slanted right like it was always leaning toward whatever came next. She didn't compliment his honesty the way people sometimes did when they were actually criticizing you gently. She just matched it. She told him she was 34, that she'd spent the last 6 years caring for her ailing mother in Philadelphia, and that her mother had died in March. She said she wasn't writing because she was desperate or directionless. She was writing because she had spent 6 years watching her mother build a life with a man whose word was worth more than any deed or title, and she believed that kind of man still existed somewhere. She was trying to find out if she was right. That last line had stayed with Silas for weeks. He wrote back. She wrote back. 7 months of letters, and somewhere in the 3rd month they stopped being formal. She told him about the way her mother used to hum while cooking, off-key and unaware of it. He told her about the ice on the river at first light, how it cracked like a pistol shot some mornings and scared the horses. Neither of them said what they might have been building, but they both knew. And now she was here, on that train. Stepping down onto a platform full of strangers and January cold, he saw her before she saw him. He'd imagined, without meaning to, someone plain, not in a harsh way, just in the way that felt safe to imagine. Someone like him, someone who looked like they'd made peace with hard things. He didn't know what he expected exactly, but he knew the moment he saw her that he hadn't expected this. She stepped off the train carrying a single leather bag and wearing a wool coat the color of charcoal, and she moved through the crowd the way water moves around stone. Not pushing, not hesitating, just finding the path that was already there. She wasn't dressed to impress anyone. But she had a quality that Silas couldn't name right away and would spend days afterward trying to pin down. It wasn't beauty, exactly, though she was that. It was more like she had decided something about herself a long time ago and hadn't revisited the question since. There was no performance in her. She was simply there, fully. She looked around the platform slowly, methodically. Her eyes passed Clayton Hurst's group of men without stopping, and they passed 3 other waiting figures, and then they found Silas. She walked straight to him. "Mr. Boone," she said. Her voice was level. Not cold, not warm, like a hand waiting to be shaken. "Miss Rhodes." He pulled his hat off, which he hadn't planned to do, and then didn't know what to do with it, so he held it at his side. "You made it." "I did." She glanced briefly at the men behind him, Clayton's crowd, still watching. "Am I what you expected?" The question caught him completely off guard. He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Clayton Hurst's voice carried across the platform like a thrown stone. "Silas Boone, you lucky son of a gun." Clayton stood up, not bothering to lower his tone. He had the voice of a man who'd never needed to. "Don't tell me that's your bride." Silas didn't turn around. Adeline looked past Silas's shoulder at Clayton for 1 flat second. Then she looked back at Silas. "Is that someone you know?" she asked quietly. "Clayton Hurst," Silas said. "He owns the East Ridge and about half of what's between here and the county line, and he likes people to know it." She picked up her bag. "Should we go?" Just like that. No performance, no visible anger, no looking back at Clayton to give him the satisfaction of her attention. She just picked up her bag and looked at Silas like the two of them had somewhere better to be. Silas didn't know why, but something in his chest shifted sideways. He took her bag from her. She let him, which surprised him a little because her grip had been firm, and they walked toward his wagon, and he could hear Clayton saying something behind him and the men laughing, and none of it mattered the way it usually did. They rode the first 2 miles in silence, not an uncomfortable silence, which Silas was used to, but something more like 2 people waiting to see who would speak honestly first. It was Adeline. "Your letters didn't tell me how far out you were," she said, watching the tree line roll past. 14 miles. Didn't want to scare you off before you arrived." She looked at him sideways. "Would 14 miles have scared me off?" "I didn't know." "What else did you leave out?" He thought about that. "The cabin's smaller than it sounds when you write about it. The kitchen window sticks. There's a corner of the roof I haven't gotten to yet. It leaks when the snow melts heavy. March is usually ugly." He paused. "The dog's name is Cobb." She almost smiled. He could see it in the way the corner of her mouth moved, like she was deciding against it. "Cobb," she repeated. "He was a yellow dog and I was eating corn when he showed up. It was the first word that came to mind." This time she did smile, small but real. They rode another mile. The sky was the low gray of mid-December, the kind of sky that promised snow by evening. "You didn't answer my question at the station," she said. He knew which one she meant. "No," he said. "You are not what I expected." "Is that a problem?" He took a moment before answering, which she seemed to understand wasn't avoidance, but just the way he was built. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm being honest." "Good," she said. "That's the only thing I asked for." The wagon hit a rut and they both lurched, and she grabbed the seat edge without flinching, and then settled back like the whole thing was perfectly ordinary. Silas thought, "She's going to leave in 2 weeks." He'd been carrying that thought since the moment he saw her on the platform. A woman like that, whatever like that meant, didn't stay. She'd see the cabin. She'd see the work. She'd count the miles to the nearest town and the years ahead and do some arithmetic that wouldn't add up the way she'd hoped. And she'd go back east politely, and he'd be fine. He'd been fine before. He told himself that very clearly. He almost believed it. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow track through pine and bare aspen, and when it came into view, Silas watched Adeline's face the way a man watches the weather. He couldn't help it. The cabin was what it was, low-roofed, weathered gray, the woodpiles stacked against one wall, Cobb's water bowl frozen solid on the porch steps, a rusted hinge on the gate that he'd been meaning to fix for a season and a half. Adeline looked at it for a long moment. "The woodpile's well stacked," she said. "I knew you were coming." "What?" She got down from the wagon before he could help her, which was the second time she'd moved faster than he expected, and she walked to the front door and pushed it open and stepped inside. Cobb exploded off the rug in the corner in a hurricane of yellow fur and confused loyalty, barking once and then wagging and then barking again, and Adeline, without any pause, crouched right down and let him smell her hand, and then she scratched behind his ears with the focused attention of someone who had done this before and meant it. "Hello, Cobb," she said. The dog's entire back end went sideways with happiness. Silas stood in the doorway, watching. "He doesn't usually warm up that fast," he said. "Dogs know," she said simply, and stood up. She looked around the single main room, kitchen to the left, the old table, two mismatched chairs, the iron stove, the shelf of supplies, the door to the back bedroom through which a wool blanket served as a second door. She didn't say anything for a moment. Silas heard himself start to apologize and stopped. He wasn't going to apologize for his home. It was real. It was his. Adeline turned around. "Where do you keep the extra quilts?" He blinked. "Top shelf in the back room. Left side." "And the stove? Wood or coal?" "Wood. Elm cuts best. I've got a cord and a half already split." She nodded like she was cataloging. "The kitchen window sticks, you said. Left side or right?" "Right. You have to lift it first before you slide." She crossed to the window and tried it, and it stuck. And she lifted and slid, and it opened. "I can fix that," she said. "I can fix that." "We can fix that," she said, and it wasn't a correction, it was just a fact, and she closed the window and turned back to the room. "Mr. Boone, Silas. She looked at him with that same level steadiness she'd had at the station. "I'm not here to appraise the property. I've seen what I came to see." "And?" She was quiet for a second. "And the letters told me more than the cabin does. The letters told me about the man who lives here. I read them more carefully than I think you know." The fire in the stove crackled. Cobb pressed his head against Adeline's knee, and she reached down and rested a hand on him without looking, the way you do with a thing that has already earned your trust. Silas didn't have a good answer for what she'd just said, so he said the true thing instead. "I'll get the horse settled. There's stew on the back of the stove. It's been keeping since this morning. Might need salt." He pulled his hat back on. "Make yourself wherever you need to be." He went outside into the cold, and he stood with the horse in the barn for a few minutes longer than necessary, one hand on the animal's neck, just breathing. She's going to leave, he thought again, except he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. By the time he came back inside, she had found the salt, the stew was steaming in two bowls on the table, and she had moved both chairs so they sat across from each other properly, instead of at the angles he'd always kept them, which was how a person arranged furniture when they'd eaten alone for years and stopped caring. She had also found a candle somewhere, he'd forgotten he even had them, and lit it in the middle of the table. She was already seated, hands folded in front of her, waiting. Silas stopped in the doorway. He couldn't remember the last time someone had waited at that table for him. He sat down. He picked up his spoon. He looked across at her in the candlelight and felt the full strange weight of this moment, a woman he barely knew, in his kitchen, in the snow-blue dark of a Montana December, and somehow it felt less foreign than he wanted it to. "The salt helped," he said. "It usually does," she said. They ate. Outside, the first snow of the evening had started, soft and steady, and Cobb had curled himself into a loop in front of the stove, and the fire spoke in low notes, and for a while no one needed to say anything at all. Later, Silas would try to explain to himself when it had happened, when exactly the thought had shifted from "she'll leave" to something quieter and harder to name. He could never find a single moment, but he thought maybe it was this one. The stew, the candle, the snow, and her hands folded still on the table as she looked at him with no agenda in her eyes. Nothing to sell and nothing to perform. Just a woman who had come 14 miles into the Montana wilderness and sat down like she'd been here before. Outside, the snow kept falling, and in the morning, there would be work. There would always be work. But that night, for the first time in 8 years, Silas Boone didn't dread walking back into his own house. That was something. That was maybe everything. The morning after Adeline arrived, Silas woke before 4 and lay still in the dark for a full minute before he remembered why the cabin felt different. There was someone else breathing in it. He could hear her through the blanket door, slow, even, the sound of someone who slept without fighting it. He'd given her the back room and taken the cot near the stove himself, and he'd lain awake longer than he wanted to admit, listening to the wind come down off the ridge and thinking about the candles she'd lit at dinner and how natural it had looked on that table he'd stopped caring about. He got up quietly, dressed in the dark the way he always did. Wool socks, flannel shirt, suspenders, boots he could lace without looking. He fed the stove 3 pieces of elm without letting the iron door clang, got the coffee going, pulled on his coat and hat, and went out to the barn before first light the same as every other morning of the past 8 years. Except when he came back inside 40 minutes later, Adeline was already up. She was standing at the stove in a plain work dress, her hair not yet pinned, adding a stick to the fire like she'd been doing it for years. She'd found the coffee. She'd found the tin cups. She had not apparently found the cream, which had frozen solid in the corner shelf overnight, and she was staring at it with an expression of mild annoyance that she didn't bother to hide. "Top of the stove," Silas said from the doorway. "Near the back. Stays liquid there." She moved it without comment, poured 2 cups, handed him one. He stood there in his coat holding the cup, and she stood there with her hair loose and her feet in thick stockings, and they drank coffee in the early dark, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. It was, if Silas was being precise about it, the most natural silence he'd had in this kitchen in years, which bothered him a little because he didn't know what to do with that. "You don't have to be up this early," he said finally. "I know," she said. "There's no obligation." "Silas." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I'm not up because I feel obligated. I'm up because I don't sleep past 5. I never have." She paused. "Is it a problem?" "No," he said. "Then drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. That was the first morning. The second was the same. The third, she was up before him. By the end of the first week, the kitchen window no longer stuck. Silas had gone for a plane from the shed, intending to shave the frame himself, and found it already done. Clean, careful work, not rushed. When he asked her about it, she said she'd watched her father fix one when she was 9 and had been paying attention. He believed her. The work showed it. What he hadn't expected, what none of the letters had prepared him for, was how quickly she learned the land. Not the way a visitor learns it, from a safe distance, admiring, the way a person learns something they intend to keep. She walked the fence line with him on day 4 in boots she'd brought that were clearly not made for Montana winters, and didn't say a word about the cold until one foot broke through a thin crust of ice over a creek crossing and she went into the knee. He stopped. She pulled her boot out, looked at the wet stocking, and said, "I'll need different boots. We can get to Harlan Creek on Saturday. What size do you normally stock at the general store?" "For women? I don't know. Mrs. Pierce would know." She nodded. Made a mental note, visibly, the way she did, a small tightening at the corner of her eyes like she was filing the information. Then she kept walking, wet boot and all. He watched her from 3 steps behind and felt something he couldn't label. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was closer to the feeling of watching a horse take a difficult piece of terrain without balking, not because it isn't hard, but because it has decided the hard thing is worth doing. Ruth Calloway came by on day 6. Ruth was 62, built like a fence post, and had an opinion on everything that had ever happened within a 30-mile radius. She'd been the one to push the correspondence pamphlet across Silas's table, and she'd been waiting 6 days to see what she'd set in motion, which meant when her wagon came up the track, she was already leaning forward like a dog on a scent. Silas saw her coming and felt the low-grade anxiety of a man who knows an inspection is occurring, whether he consented to one or not. Adeline was in the yard when Ruth arrived, trying to coax a young heifer back through a gap in the side fence that the animal had apparently found interesting enough to return to 3 times already that morning. She had a length of rope in one hand and her patience on full display, and she was talking to the heifer in a low, steady voice that was accomplishing more than the rope. Ruth pulled her wagon to a stop and watched for a solid 15 seconds before she climbed down. "Silas didn't tell me you could work livestock," Ruth said, by way of introduction. Adeline glanced up. "I'm mostly failing," she said. "You're doing better than you think. She's a bolter, that one. Has been since she was a calf. Don't let her get her head turned west or she'll go for the gap again." Adeline repositioned without questioning the advice, and the heifer, confused by the new angle, gave up and walked back through the fence properly. Adeline latched it. "Ruth Calloway," Ruth said, putting out her hand. "Adeline Boone," Adeline said, and shook it. Silas, watching from 10 feet away, noticed that Adeline had used his name, not Rhodes. Boone. 7 days in, and she'd made the choice quietly, without announcement, and he wasn't sure if she'd even registered doing it. He registered it. Ruth stayed 2 hours. She drank coffee and asked questions with the tact of a cattle prod, and Adeline answered them all without flinching and without performing. When Ruth asked why she'd left Philadelphia, Adeline said her mother had died and there was nothing left to keep her somewhere that had stopped feeling like home. When Ruth asked why a mail-order arrangement instead of meeting someone locally, Adeline said because the men she'd met locally had wanted someone to fill a shape they'd already decided on, and she didn't fit shapes well. Ruth laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and Silas saw something shift in the older woman's face. Not approval exactly. Recognition. After Ruth left, Silas said, "She'll tell everyone in the valley you're here." "She already knew I was here," Adeline said, washing the cups. "She just wanted to form her own opinion." "And?" Adeline glanced at him. "I think she approved, but she wasn't going to say it out loud. She never does." "Then she's practical," Adeline said. "I like that." The rumors started the following week, which was faster than Silas had hoped and slower than he'd feared. He heard the first one from Tom Greeley at the feed store, a big, slow-talking man who meant no harm but couldn't keep a thought inside his head, who asked Silas with genuine friendly curiosity whether it was true that his new wife had come from money back east and was just out here on some kind of personal adventure before she went back. Silas said no, that wasn't true. Tom nodded and said he hadn't thought so, but that people were saying things. Silas asked which people. Tom got vague in the way people do when they know who started something but don't want to be the one to say. Silas had a suspicion. He left it there. The second rumor was worse. It reached him through Ruth, who delivered it with the grim efficiency of a woman who believed in telling people what they needed to hear. Someone, Ruth had a name, but was holding it, had said that Adeline Rhodes had come to Montana running from something. A broken engagement, or debt, or some unspecified scandal in Philadelphia that she was hoping distance would bury. Silas heard that and said nothing. He sat with it through 2 days of fence work and evening chores and woke up on the third day still chewing on it. And finally, at breakfast, said, "There's a story going around that you came here to run from something." Adeline was cutting bread. She didn't stop. "I know," she said. He waited. She put the knife down and turned around. "Is that what you think?" "I'm asking what's true." She looked at him for a long moment. "My mother was sick for 6 years. I spent those years caring for her, which meant I wasn't doing anything else. No courting, no social life, nothing that would have given people in Philadelphia anything to talk about. When she died, I was 34, unmarried, and had no income of my own. In those circles, that's scandal enough." She picked up the knife and finished cutting the bread. "There's nothing dramatic. I'm just a woman who ran out of reasons to stay somewhere that had stopped making sense." "That's it?" "That's it." She set 2 slices on his plate. "Disappointing, I know." "It's not disappointing," he said. "I believe you." "I didn't need you to believe me," she said. "I just told you the truth because you asked." She sat down across from him. "Though I'll say, if I were running from something, I think Montana in December would be a strange choice of hiding place." He almost smiled. "Most people would say the same." "And yet here we both are," she said, and looked down at her bread. And that was the end of it. He believed her, but he noticed she'd answered quickly, cleanly, in a way that covered the question without leaving room for the next one. He wasn't sure if that was just how she was built, or if there were rooms in her he hadn't been handed keys to yet. He told himself it was early. 7 letters and 10 days was not a person. It was a beginning. He tried to keep that straight in his mind. The morning of the third Sunday, Adeline was gone before he woke up. Not gone. Her coat was missing from the hook and her boots, but her bag was still in the back room, and Cobb was sitting at the front door with the baffled patience of a dog who had watched her leave and had not been invited. Silas stood in the kitchen for a moment, then looked out the window. Fresh tracks in the snow headed north toward the upper pasture fence line and beyond it toward the long hill that ran above the valley. He didn't follow her. He went about his morning, fed the horses, broke ice on the water trough, stacked the wood she'd been splitting the day before because she'd started, and he'd finished because she wouldn't ask for help, and he'd stopped waiting to be asked. He kept looking north. He couldn't help it. She was back by noon. Her cheeks were red from cold, and she had snow in her hair, and she didn't explain where she'd been. She just came inside and took off her coat and washed her hands and asked if he'd eaten anything since morning. He hadn't. She made soup. He didn't ask. He told himself once was nothing. A person needed solitude sometimes. He knew that better than most. He'd built his entire existence around it. The second Sunday, same thing. Gone before light, back by noon, no explanation. The third Sunday, Cobb whined at the door for an hour after she left, and Silas, standing at the kitchen window watching the hill in the distance, felt something cold slide through him that wasn't the January air. Not jealousy, exactly. Not suspicion. Something more like the particular helplessness of caring about a thing you can't see clearly. He still didn't follow her. He wanted to. And the fact that he wanted to told him something about where he was, which was somewhere he hadn't planned to be this fast. It was in the fourth week that the situation with Clayton Hurst made itself impossible to ignore. Silas had known Clayton for 11 years, which was long enough to understand the man without respecting him. Clayton had inherited the Hurst land at 30 and then spent the next decade buying everything adjacent to it through a combination of money and pressure that stopped just short of anything anyone could take to a judge. He was not a man who threatened directly. He was a man who made futures look smaller until the person across from him took the deal. He'd tried it with Silas twice. Both times Silas had said no without visible emotion and gone home. Clayton had never forgiven that. Not the refusal, but the absence of fear. The encounter at Miller's Hardware came without warning, the way Clayton's appearances usually did. Silas was at the counter with a list of hinges when Clayton walked in with 2 of his men and stopped, and looked at Silas with that wide, easy smile that never quite reached anywhere useful. "Silas Boone," he said, "I keep hearing the most interesting things about your new wife." "Hardware store," Silas said, not looking up from his list. "Not the place." "Where is the place?" "Because I've been meaning to pay a social call. We're neighbors of a kind. We're 14 miles apart. Distance is relative." Clayton leaned on the counter. "They're saying she's remarkable. Eastern girl, educated, doesn't complain, knows how to work." He paused. "They're also saying she's wasted out there on that slope." Silas folded his list. He turned and looked at Clayton directly. "Say what you mean, or don't say anything." Clayton held his hands up, the picture of reasonableness. "I mean nothing by it. I'm just saying, a woman with her qualities could have a different kind of life. A better one. Warmer house, fewer miles from town. A man with more to offer." He smiled again. "I've been through 3 wives, Silas. I know what it takes to keep a woman happy." "I'll need 8 3-inch hinges," Silas said, turning back to the counter, "and a box of the flathead nails if you have them in stock." He paid for his hardware. He walked out. He did not look at Clayton on the way past. He got in the wagon. He drove 14 miles home. He carried the hinges inside and set them on the table and stood there with his hands flat on the wood and his heart hammering at a rate that surprised him. Because it wasn't anger, or not only anger. It was the specific terror of a man who has started to want something and has just been reminded how easily it can be taken. Adeline came in from the barn a few minutes later, pulling off her work gloves. She looked at him, then at the hinges on the table, then back at him. "What happened?" she said. "Clayton Hurst." She was quiet. "He implied," Silas started, and then stopped, because how do you finish that sentence without sounding like a man staking a claim on a person who has the full right to walk out any door she chooses? "I heard about him," Adeline said. She sat down across from him. Ruth told me. She told me on her second visit, the one you didn't know she made. She said it without apology. She told me he's a man who believes everything in the valley has a price, and he just hasn't named the right one yet. That's accurate. She also told me he tried to buy your land twice. 3 times, Silas said. Adeline looked at him steadily. Then he already knows something about you that he doesn't like, and now he's found a different angle. She folded her work gloves. Is that what worries you, that he'll try to use me as an angle? He didn't answer right away. Silas? Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. There was a difference. I'm not a prize someone can come along and offer a better deal for. I made a choice when I got on that train. I don't make choices I'm not prepared to stand behind. I know that, he said, intellectually. But, he looked at the hinges. But you could have a warmer house. You could have... Stop. She said it without heat, but firmly. Don't do that. Don't list what I could have as if I can't see it myself. I'm not here because I couldn't see the other options. I'm here because I saw them and chose this. She pushed back her chair and stood up. I'm going to put these hinges on the gate before the light goes. I can do that. We can do it, she said, the same way she'd said it about the window. She picked up 3 of the hinges and went back outside, and Silas gathered the remaining 5 and followed her, and they worked on the gate together in the failing winter light without talking. And when her fingers got too cold to hold the screws properly, she didn't say so, but switched to holding the gate steady while he drove them in, and they had it done before dark. That night she made cornbread from somewhere in her memory of a recipe she'd seen once, and told him it might not be right. It wasn't quite right. It was too dense and slightly undersalted, and she ate it without complaint, and so did he, and it was the best thing he'd eaten in months, which didn't make sense but was true anyway. Cobb ate the piece she dropped and looked at her like she was extraordinary. The 4th Sunday arrived and she was gone again, and this time Silas stood at the window for a long while, watching the hill through the glass, and then did something he hadn't done since he was a young man trying to make sense of something bigger than himself. He went out to the north pasture and stood at the base of the hill and looked up. He could see her at the top. Just her outline in the gray winter morning, standing still, facing the valley. Not moving, not looking around, just standing there with her hands at her sides and her face turned south like she was watching for something. He didn't go up. He went back to the barn and he worked, and when she came back at noon and found him still at the barn, she stopped in the doorway and looked at him, and he could see that she knew he'd seen her. Neither of them said anything about it, but something had shifted between them, some understanding that was too fragile to name yet, too real to pretend away. She knew he knew. He knew she knew he hadn't followed, and in that mutual silence was a kind of respect that neither of them had words for yet. That evening, the temperature dropped to 12 below. The pipes in the east wall groaned all night, and Silas got up twice to bank the stove. The second time, he found Adeline already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of something hot between both hands. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "The cold woke me," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She poured him a cup of whatever she'd made, something with dried herbs she'd found in a tin at the back of the shelf. A smell he didn't quite recognize, but that was warm and settled him anyway. They sat with the stove crackling between them and the cold pressing against every wall of the cabin, and neither of them making a move to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. And in that quiet, in the particular intimacy of 2 people keeping each other company against the dark, Silas felt for the first time something settle in him. Not certainty, not resolution. Just a loosening of the grip he'd kept on himself for 8 years, the constant low-level bracing for being alone that a person stops noticing because it becomes the same as breathing. It loosened, just slightly, just enough to notice. "Thank you," he said. She looked up. "For what?" He didn't have a clean answer. "For staying," he said finally. "I know it's only been 4 weeks, but..." She looked at him over her cup. "But you expected me to leave." "Most people would have." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy." She looked down at her cup. "I'm still figuring out what kind of person I am, but I know I'm not one who leaves before she's finished." The stove popped. Cobb shifted on the rug. Neither am I, Silas said. She nodded once, like that was enough, like they had settled something without either of them having to frame it as a settlement. They stayed up another hour, not talking much, and then went back to sleep separately. And in the morning, the pipes were fine and the temperature had climbed and there was work to do. There was always work to do. But Silas noticed, heading out to the barn with the sky still black overhead, that his boots felt lighter on the frozen ground than they had in years. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't sure he needed to. He just moved through the cold morning and let that be enough. February came in hard. The kind of hard that Montana saved for people who had started to feel comfortable, who had begun to think they understood winter here, who had let themselves believe the worst of it was behind them. 3 days of wind that came off the northern ridge like something with a purpose, driving snow horizontal and dropping the temperature to places the thermometer at the barn door wasn't calibrated to reach. The cattle huddled at the south fence, and Silas and Adeline worked in shifts, breaking ice from the water troughs every 4 hours through the night, carrying feed through drifts that reached Adeline's hip in the lower pasture. She didn't complain. She didn't ask to stop. The second night, around 2 in the morning, she stumbled going back from the barn and went down hard in the snow, and Silas, coming behind her, got her arm before she'd even fully registered what happened. He pulled her up. She stood, checked her hands, brushed the snow off her coat with brisk, businesslike movements. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask. "I know," he said, and let go of her arm, and they kept walking. He thought about that moment later. The automatic way she'd said, "I'm fine," not defensive, just factual, like she was used to accounting for herself quickly so nobody would worry. He recognized it because he did the same thing, had been doing it for years. It was the reflex of a person who had spent a long time managing their own difficulties without inconveniencing anyone. The storm broke on the 4th morning and left behind a stillness so complete it felt almost rude. Silas stood on the porch and looked out at a world gone white and repacked and quiet. And Adeline stood beside him with her coffee, and Cobb sat between them on the top step with his chin on his paws, and none of them moved for a while. "We lost 2 fence posts on the north line," Silas said. "I saw. And the lean-to on the east side of the barn is pulling away from the wall." "I know." "I can hold the boards while you nail them back," she said. "It'll be cold work." "It'll be cold standing in the kitchen, too," she said. He looked at her sideways. She was looking out at the snow, her cup held in both hands, and there was something in her face that was not quite contentment. It was more settled than that, and more tired, and more real. The face of someone who had chosen a hard thing and was still choosing it every morning without drama. He wanted to say something. He couldn't find what. "Lean-to first," he said. "Then the fence." "Lean-to first," she agreed. They worked all morning. By noon, the lean-to was secured imperfectly but firmly, and they had started on the fence posts, Adeline tamping the new post in place while Silas drove the cross rails, and neither of them talking much because the work didn't require it. Around 1 o'clock, one of the rails split wrong and sprung back and caught Silas across the knuckles of his left hand, and he said a word he immediately regretted with Adeline standing 3 feet away. She looked at his hand, then at him. "I've heard worse," she said. "Still shouldn't—" "Silas." She said his name the way she sometimes did, with a sort of quiet authority that wasn't scolding, just grounding. "It's a split rail in February. Say whatever seems appropriate." He almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that she saw it, and something in her face eased. "Let me see it," she said. She took his hand and looked at the knuckles, which were already purpling, and she pressed on them with 2 fingers in a way that was efficient rather than gentle, assessing, not consoling. "Not broken," she said. "Bruised. You'll be stiff tomorrow." "I've been stiff every day since I was 35. "Then tomorrow will be familiar." She let go of his hand and went back to the post. That was February. March arrived with mud and the particular misery of a Montana thaw, which was not the gentle softening that people in warmer climates imagined, but rather a sustained argument between frozen ground and running water, resulting in a ranch that looked, Adeline said one evening with flat accuracy, like the earth had given up caring about itself. "It does this every year," Silas said. "You might have mentioned it." "I mentioned March was ugly." "You said usually ugly." He considered that. "I may have softened it." She looked at him over the dinner table. What else did you soften? April's worse, he said. She stared at him for a full 3 seconds, and then something cracked open in her face, and she laughed. Actually laughed. Not the small, controlled smile he'd been seeing, but a real laugh, head back slightly, entirely unguarded, and it changed her face in a way that hit Silas somewhere between the sternum and the throat, and stayed there. April's worse, she repeated, shaking her head. But May is good, he offered. May is genuinely good. I'll hold you to that, she said. But March brought something else with it, something Silas had been half expecting since the encounter at Miller's Hardware and had been hoping unreasonably to avoid. Clayton Hurst came to the ranch. He came alone, which was unusual for Clayton, who generally moved with at least one other man present as an audience. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when the mud had frozen solid overnight and the track up to the cabin was passable. And he rode a gray horse worth more than most of the homesteads in the valley and tied it to the post near the water trough and knocked on the door with the easy confidence of a man who had never seriously expected to be turned away from anything. Adeline answered it. Silas was in the barn. He didn't know any of this until he came in from the barn 20 minutes later and found Clayton Hurst sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Adeline standing at the stove with her back to both of them. Silas stopped in the doorway. Silas, Clayton raised his coffee cup. I was in the area. Thought I'd pay that social call? You weren't in the area, Silas said. This isn't on the way to anywhere. Well, Clayton smiled, then call it a deliberate visit. He looked around the kitchen with the slow, appraising look of a man calculating what things were worth. You've got it looking better in here. Some kind of woman's touch. I have a wife, Silas said. You do. Clayton looked at Adeline's back. Mrs. Boone, your husband's lucky to have someone who can manage a place like this. Adeline turned around. She held her own coffee cup, and she looked at Clayton with the same flat, clear steadiness she'd turned on the platform when he'd performed for his audience. Not hostile, just unimpressed. What brings you out, Mr. Hurst? She said. Clayton set his cup down. I'll be direct, since you seem like someone who appreciates that. I'm putting together a consortium of valley ranchers, buying up the southern grazing rights, improving the road into Harlan Creek, building a proper community hall. Anyone who partners with me gets preferential grazing rates and a seat at the table when it comes to the county commission. He looked at Silas. Including you, Silas, if you're interested. What's the cost? Silas said. Nominal. A small land contribution. The corner parcel on your southeast boundary. The one you don't graze anyway. 50 acres. That parcel has the creek. A small creek. In summer, when the main river drops, that small creek is the only water for the lower pasture, Silas said. You know that. Clayton's smile didn't waver. There are always solutions. Water rights can be... No, Silas said. The word landed flat and simple, and Clayton's smile thinned just slightly at the edges. Think about it, Clayton said. I have, Silas said. Same answer. Clayton sat for another moment. Then he looked at Adeline with a different quality of attention, speculative, slow. Mrs. Boone, you seem like a practical woman. Surely you can see the advantages of being connected to the larger operation in this valley. The isolation out here can't be easy for a woman of your background. Adeline met his gaze without hurry. My background doesn't mind isolation, she said, and my husband's already answered the question. Something moved across Clayton's face. Not anger, something more controlled than that. The recalibration of a man who had identified a problem he hadn't fully accounted for. He stood up, picked up his hat. The offer stands, he said. For a while. He showed himself out. They heard his horse leave. Silas stood in the kitchen and looked at the cup Clayton had left on his table and felt the old cold anger, the specific kind that came not from the affront itself, but from the recognition that the affront would keep coming, in new shapes, until something definitive happened. He's not going to stop, Silas said. No, Adeline agreed. She picked up the cup and washed it. But he's not getting the creek parcel. No. She set the cup down and turned and looked at him. Did he try this with the land before I arrived? Twice. And the third time was through me. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then he's getting more desperate or more creative. She dried the cup. Either way, it means he thinks you have something worth taking. That's not the worst thing to know about your situation. Silas looked at her. You're not angry? I'm angry, she said simply. But angry doesn't fix the creek parcel. Let's be sure the fence line papers are filed with the county clerk and the water rights are documented correctly. He'd had them filed, but he went the next day and checked. She was right to say it. A thing only protects you if it's actually in place. The papers were in order. He felt slightly foolish for needing to verify, and then felt less foolish when he found one filing that was 2 years overdue for renewal. He renewed it. He came home and told her, and she said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing, which was patching a section of leather harness with the focused frown of someone determined to get it right. She was 3 weeks into her habit of the Sunday hill when Ruth Calloway, coming by for what had become a semi-regular Thursday visit, mentioned it first. "People have been seeing your wife up on the Haverfield Rise," Ruth said, not quite carefully enough, which with Ruth usually meant she'd been trying to ask for a week. Alone, early mornings. Silas was fixing a chair leg at the kitchen table. "I know." Ruth waited. "Do you know why?" "She hasn't said." Ruth's mouth tightened in a way that meant she had thoughts and was exercising unusual restraint. "You haven't asked?" "Not my right to demand an explanation for where she goes," Silas said. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "That's either very respectful or very scared." He drove a nail into the chair leg and didn't answer. Ruth left shortly after, but her question stayed, the way Ruth's questions tended to. Very respectful or very scared. He'd been telling himself it was the former, and the fact that he needed to keep telling himself said something he didn't want to look at directly. The 4th Sunday in March, Adeline came back from the hill later than usual. It was past 1 o'clock. Silas had eaten lunch alone and was out at the fence when he saw her coming across the lower pasture, and something about the way she was walking told him this return was different from the others. Slower, her head slightly down, her hands tucked against her sides. She walked past him without stopping, which she never did. "Adeline." She stopped, turned, and he saw that she'd been crying. Not actively, not dramatically, but her eyes were red-rimmed and her face had the particular scraped look of grief that's been held for a long time and has finally found its moment. She stood there in the mud of the lower pasture looking at him, and he didn't know the right thing to say, so he said the true thing. "You don't have to tell me," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." Something in her face shifted. She looked away for a moment at the hill, then back at him. "It's the same day," she said, "every year. She died on a Sunday in March." He kept his eyes on her face and didn't speak. "I promised her I'd find somewhere real," Adeline said. "Not comfortable. Real. She was sick for a long time, and she watched what people became when comfort was all they were chasing. Men who looked good on paper and weren't worth a thing when it mattered." Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight in the way of someone choosing each word carefully because the other ones are too close to the surface. "She made me promise I wouldn't do that I'd find someone whose character couldn't be bought." She stopped. "I go up there to keep the promise, to tell her." Silas stood with that for a moment. "Tell her what?" he said. Adeline looked at him directly. "That I'm keeping it." The world went very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens not because there's no sound, but because every sound seems to move back politely. Silas Boone was not a man who said things he hadn't meant. He did not say thank you, or that means everything, or any of the soft things that might have come easier to another man. He just nodded once and held her gaze and let the weight of what she'd said be where it was without putting anything on top of it. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. "She would have liked it here," Adeline said. "She'd have been terrible at the cold, but she would have liked it." He almost smiled. "Most people are." "She also would have said you should charge more for your grazing rights," Adeline said, and the shift was deliberate. He could see her choosing it, steering herself back to solid ground. "Because Ruth told me what the Kellerman Ranch charges and you're under by 30%. Kellerman's on a better road. You're on better water." He looked at her. She wiped her eyes once, briskly, in the way someone removes something from a surface that has no business being there. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "It's always cold," she said, but she walked beside him to the cabin, and Cobb met them at the door with his usual unfettered joy, and she bent down and buried her face briefly in his yellow fur in a way she'd never done before. And Silas kept walking to the stove and started the coffee without looking, because she needed that moment to be hers. April was, in fact, worse. The roof corner he'd mentioned finally started leaking in earnest during a 3-day rain, and they spent an ugly Saturday afternoon with a bucket in the corner of the back room and tar paper and questionable results. And Adeline crouched on the roof in the rain while he handed things up to her, and she said, at one point, loudly into the rain, "You should have fixed this in November." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" "I kept thinking I'd get to it." "That is the least useful sentence in any language," she said, and pressed the tar paper harder. The leak slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. They came down off the roof and stood in the barn until the rain eased, and she had mud on her hands and her coat and a bright anger in her face that was not directed at him exactly, but at the general injustice of roofs that waited until rain to fail. "I'll do it properly in May," he said. "In May," she repeated. "I know how. I just—" "Silas." She looked at him. "Tell me when you need help. Not because you can't do it. Because 2 people doing it means it gets done before it rains." He stood with that. "I'm not used to but—" "I know you're not used to it," she said. "Neither am I. But we keep doing things we're not used to, apparently." He didn't have an argument against that. She was right, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and they walked back to the cabin in the lessening rain and changed into dry clothes, her in the back room, him at the stove, and she made cornbread again, better this time. And they ate in the usual semi-silence that had stopped feeling empty a long time ago. He was almost asleep that night when he understood what she'd said. "Tell me when you need help." Not offered. Instructed. The difference between someone being kind and someone being committed. He lay in the dark thinking about the hill, and her mother, and a promise made to a dying woman in a Philadelphia house he'd never see. He thought about the 7 months of letters and how she'd said, "I read them more carefully than you know." He thought about Clayton Hurst's face in his kitchen and the way she'd stood at the stove with her back to him, not hiding, he understood now, but refusing to perform for someone who wasn't worth performing for. He thought about her laughing at the dinner table in March, her head back, entirely unguarded, when he'd told her April was worse. He thought about all the things he'd been afraid of since she stepped off that train, that she'd leave, that she'd regret it, that she was out of his league in some fundamental way that would eventually become obvious to both of them and make everything complicated. None of those fears had gone away. He was not built for easy certainty, but something else had been growing alongside them that he hadn't expected. A quiet, persistent sense that whatever Adeline Rhodes had been looking for when she wrote that first letter, she had not been wrong to come here. Not because he deserved her, he was nowhere near arrogant enough to settle on that, but because what they had built in 4 months in this leaking, mud-soaked, frost-bitten ranch was something that felt, against all reasonable expectations, like a foundation. Not romance, or not only that, something more durable. The kind of thing built from 2 people choosing the hard work over the easy exit, day after day, until the choosing became the thing itself. He was still afraid. That wasn't going away. But he was also, for the first time in longer than he could track, something close to certain that the fear was worth having, that it meant he was holding something real. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in late April, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the county clerk, in an envelope with a Philadelphia return address that Adeline saw from across the kitchen and went very still at, in the specific way of someone who recognized the handwriting. Silas handed it to her without comment. She stood at the kitchen table and read it, and he went out to the barn and stayed there longer than necessary, because whatever was in that letter was hers first. And he had learned, slowly, imperfectly, that the best thing he could give her was the room to be herself without an audience. When he came back an hour later, she was sitting at the table with the letter folded in front of her and both hands flat on the surface, and she looked like someone who had just been handed a problem she hadn't finished calculating yet. "It's from my mother's sister," she said, My Aunt Frances. She paused. She's coming to Montana. Silas sat down across from her. When? 6 weeks. He waited. She's bringing papers, Adeline said. There's a trust. My mother set one up. I didn't know she had the means to, but apparently she'd kept things separate from what I could see during the illness. She looked at the letter and then at him. It's substantial, Silas. Frances says. She stopped. It's enough to change everything. The word everything sat between them for a moment. Change everything how? He said carefully. She looked up at him. She thinks I'll want to go back. The fire crackled. Cobb shifted. Outside, the last of April's cold rain tapped against the mended roof. Do you? Silas said. Silas? She didn't answer immediately, which was not the same as hesitating. It was the same as her, taking the question seriously, the way she took every question that deserved it. I don't know yet what I want to do with it, she said, but I know I'm not leaving because of it. She met his eyes. That's not the same thing as having a plan. No, he agreed. But it's enough for now. She nodded, folded the letter, set it on the shelf where important things went. They had supper. They talked about the grazing rotation for May and the fence post still needed on the west line, and whether the heifer Ruth had identified as a bolter had finally accepted her lot. And if both of them were aware of the letter on the shelf throughout the whole evening, neither of them brought it back up. Some things needed to sit before they needed to be solved. That was something Silas had always known. It was something, he thought, watching Adeline wash the dishes in the lamplight with the quiet sureness of a woman entirely present in her own life, that she had always known too. Two people who'd been alone long enough to understand that not every silence was emptiness. Some silences were just room to breathe, to think, to let something settle before the next hard thing arrived. Outside, the April rain kept on. Inside, the stove held, and in 6 weeks everything might look different. But tonight it looked like this: a cabin, a fire, a yellow dog on the rug, and two people who had chosen each other on a frozen platform in December and had not, despite every reasonable opportunity, stopped choosing since. That was the truth of it. That was all of it, for now. Aunt Frances arrived on a Thursday, which was not the day she'd said she would arrive, and in a hired coach rather than the supply wagon Silas had offered to send, which told him something about Frances before he'd exchanged a word with her. She was 60, or close to it, and she carried herself with the particular uprightness of a woman who had decided somewhere in her 40s that the world would meet her standards or explain itself. She wore a traveling coat that cost more than Silas's winter feed bill, and she stepped down from the coach onto the muddy track leading to the cabin and looked at the mud with an expression she controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Adeline was on the porch. She'd known somehow that Frances was coming today instead of Saturday, some instinct, or maybe just the knowledge of how her aunt operated. She'd said nothing to Silas that morning except that she'd like him nearby. He was nearby. He was at the fence post 10 yards to the left of the cabin, which needed no work at all, doing work it didn't need. Frances, Adeline said. Adeline. Frances looked her over with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection they had every intention of completing. Her eyes moved to the cabin, the barn, the fence post where Silas was applying unnecessary effort to a perfectly sound rail. This is, she started. Home, Adeline said. Frances made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. May I come in? Of course. Silas set his tools down and followed them inside at a distance that he hoped communicated present, but not hovering. He was not entirely sure he achieved it. The kitchen was clean, cleaner than it had been in December, different in a dozen ways that had happened gradually enough that he'd stopped noticing each one individually and only saw them all at once when he looked through Frances's eyes. The window that used to stick opened freely. There were dried herbs on the shelf that hadn't been there before. The mismatched chairs had been joined by a third that Adeline had repaired herself from a broken one in the barn. A rug he didn't remember acquiring had appeared in front of the stove sometime in February. Frances sat in the repaired chair, which Silas thought might have been intentional on Adeline's part. He made coffee because it gave him something to do with his hands, and because this was his kitchen and he was going to behave like it. Francis accepted the cup and opened a leather satchel and produced a sheaf of documents with the efficient movements of a woman who had been handling other people's practical matters for years. She set them on the table with a precision that suggested she'd also been rehearsing this. "Your mother's estate," she said to Adeline. "The full accounting." She slid the top document across. She was more careful with money than anyone knew, even me, until after. Adeline looked at the papers without touching them. Francis glanced at Silas. "Should we—" "Whatever you say to me, you can say in front of my husband," Adeline said. Francis absorbed this. "Very well." She tapped the document. "The figure at the bottom of the first page. That is the total of the liquid assets remaining after the estate taxes and legal fees." Adeline turned the page and looked. She didn't change expression. Silas, seated across from her, watched her face and learned nothing from it, which told him the number was significant. She'd have reacted more visibly to something trivial. "She never—" Adeline stopped. "She let me think there was almost nothing." "She didn't want you making choices based on money," Francis said, not without gentleness. "She wanted you making choices based on what you actually wanted." Adeline set the page down. "She could have told me." "She could have. She chose not to." Francis's voice was precise but not unkind. "You can be angry about that, but you'd probably have done the same in her position." Adeline sat with that. Silas watched the small tightening across her jaw and recognized it, the look of someone absorbing a truth they weren't ready to contest yet. "There's a second matter," Francis said. She produced another document. "Your mother owned property in Philadelphia, the house where you both lived. It's been managed by an agent since March. It's yours now. You can sell it, keep it, rent it." She paused, "or return to it." The words were careful, not pushy, but they landed exactly where Francis intended them. Silas kept his eyes on his coffee cup. "Francis," Adeline said, and her voice was very even. "Did you come here to deliver papers or to bring me back?" Francis met her niece's gaze without flinching. "Both, if I'm honest." She said it cleanly, without apology. "I love you, your mother loved you, and I want to understand that you're here because you chose it, not because you didn't know what your options were." "I chose it before I knew about the money," Adeline said. "I know. That's why I'm here in person instead of sending a solicitor." Francis looked around the kitchen once more, not with contempt, Silas thought, but with the genuine effort of a woman trying to see what her niece saw. "I wanted to see it. I wanted to meet—" She glanced at Silas briefly. "The man she chose." Silas said nothing. He was aware this was not his moment. Francis picked up her cup, drank, set it down. She looked at Silas directly then, for the first time since sitting down, the full weight of an intelligent woman's assessment. "You fixed the window frame," she said. Silas blinked. Adeline mentioned it in her letters, said it used to stick. Francis looked at the window. "You fixed it." "She fixed it," Silas said. Something moved across Francis's face. "Did she?" "First week," he said. "I was going to get to it. She got there first." Francis looked at Adeline. Adeline was looking at the documents. Then she looked up and met her aunt's eyes, and something passed between them. Some shorthand only two people with a shared history could read. Francis made a small sound, put down her cup, straightened her documents. "I'll need a few days," she said, "before I go back, if that's not an imposition." "There's a room in Harlan Creek," Adeline began. "She can stay here," Silas said. Both women looked at him. He hadn't planned to say it. It had just been the right thing, so he said it. "It's not much, but it's warmer than the Harlan Creek boarding house in May. We'll manage." Francis studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Silas," he said. She nodded once. "Silas." That was Friday. The public meeting, if a gathering at Miller's Hardware could be called that, which it couldn't quite, but which functioned as one because it was the largest indoor space in Harlan Creek, and people came to it when things needed to be decided, was Saturday. Silas had known about it for 2 weeks. It had been called by Clayton Hurst under the formal description of a Valley resource planning discussion, which meant exactly nothing except that Clayton wanted an audience for something and had found a polite name for it. He hadn't planned to go. He'd told himself it was because he had work. It was actually because he'd attended enough of Clayton's performances to know how they ended, which was with everyone in the room slightly diminished except Clayton, who'd found another way to be the largest thing in the space. Adeline found the notice on the table Thursday evening and read it and said nothing for a moment. "Are you going?" she asked. "I wasn't planning to." She looked at him. "You should." "So you can perform for an audience?" "So the people in that room see you there," she said. "A man who doesn't show up stops being real to people. Clayton knows that." He looked at the notice. "I'll come with you," she said. He started to say she didn't need to. "Francis, too," Adeline said, and something in her voice had taken on a quality he'd learned to recognize, a clarity, a decision already made, the words following after rather than leading. Frances, for her part, seemed entirely prepared for a community gathering in a frontier hardware store, which confirmed something Silas had already begun to suspect about her, which was that her stiffness was a manner rather than a character. They drove in the next morning, all three of them, Silas at the reins and Adeline in the middle, and Frances on the outside with her Philadelphia coat and an expression of composed curiosity. Cobb had been left home because public meetings were already enough of an ordeal without a yellow dog making opinions about strangers. Miller's Hardware was already full when they arrived. 20, maybe 25 people, ranchers, their wives, a few of the younger men who worked at Clayton's Eastern operation, Tom Greeley near the back, looking congenial and slightly confused, as was his standard state. Ruth Calloway was against the west wall with her arms folded in the manner of someone who had come to observe rather than participate, and intended to make that distinction clear if necessary. Clayton was at the front. He'd set up a map on the wall, a genuine survey map rolled out and pinned, and he was talking when they came in, but he stopped when he saw Silas, and then his eyes moved to Adeline, and then to Frances. Something in his expression recalculated. Silas took a spot near the door. Adeline stood beside him. Frances found a position 3 feet to Adeline's right, with the self-possession of a woman who had walked into more important rooms than this. Clayton resumed. He was good at it. Silas had always acknowledged that. He spoke with the ease of a man used to being listened to, and he laid out his consortium proposal with the confident enthusiasm of a person presenting a foregone conclusion. Preferential grazing rights. The county road. The community hall. A new arrangement that would, he said, bring the valley together and give everyone a real stake in the future. He described the land contributions required in terms that made them sound minor. He named the families already committed in a tone that implied being unaffiliated was a kind of social failure. Then he looked at Silas. "Boone," he said, in the warm manner of a man performing warmth. "We'd like the Boone spread involved. I think everyone here knows the value of the South Slope grazing and the creek access, a real asset to the consortium." The room shifted subtly. Not much, just the particular attentiveness of people who know a harder thing is about to be said. Silas opened his mouth. Adeline spoke first. "Mr. Hurst," her voice was clear and completely level, "I'd like to understand the water rights structure before we go further." Clayton looked at her. "It's not complex. Humor me." She stepped forward slightly, not enough to be aggressive, enough to establish that she was speaking from the floor and not from the back of the room. "Under your proposal, the creek parcel would be absorbed into the consortium's collective holdings. Who administers collective holdings?" "A board, of which the Boone Ranch would be a member. A board where voting weight is proportional to contributed acreage." She tilted her head slightly. "Which would give your operation controlling interest." A silence. Clayton's smile held. "It's a democratic structure." "In name," Adeline said. "Mr. Hurst, I spent 6 years managing my mother's estate in Philadelphia, and I've read more partnership agreements than I'd like to count. What you're describing is a structure in which the smaller operations contribute real assets and receive advisory seats, while the largest stakeholder retains effective control." She looked around the room once, quickly. "That's not a partnership. That's an acquisition with extra steps." The room was very quiet. Clayton had the look of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and discovered he'd been handed a version he hadn't prepared for. "Mrs. Boone," he said, and now the warmth was thinner. I appreciate the perspective, but these are complex matters, and perhaps we're standing in a hardware store in Harlan Creek, she said. If the proposal can't be explained plainly, that's useful information. She folded her hands. I'm not saying the road improvements aren't worth discussing. They are. I'm saying the land structure as you've drawn it isn't equitable, and I suspect most of the ranchers in this room would see that clearly if they read the terms side by side. Ruth Calloway, against the west wall, unfolded her arms. Tom Greeley said, from the back, with his usual friendly confusion, "Can someone explain what she said about the voting? I didn't follow the acreage part." Someone else did follow it. Two more asked questions. The next 40 minutes were not what Clayton Hurst had planned. He did not lose the room dramatically. It was quieter than that, and more final. The steady, piece-by-piece withdrawal of deference from people who had been prepared to give it until they'd been given a reason to look more closely. When the gathering broke up, nothing had been voted on and nothing had been decided, which was exactly the outcome Clayton had been trying to avoid. He crossed the room toward Silas and Adeline on his way out. His expression was composed, his eyes were not. "Your wife makes an interesting case," he said to Silas. "She usually does," Silas said. Clayton looked at Adeline. "The offer still stands, the original one?" His voice had lost the performance quality. This was something more direct, more honest in its way, which made it more unsettling. A woman with your clarity of mind could do considerably more than manage a ranch on the western slope. "I'm not managing a ranch," Adeline said. "I'm building one." She met his eyes without looking away. "There's a difference, Mr. Hurst. I imagine you know what it is." Clayton held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his face, not quite respect, but the proximate thing a man like Clayton Hurst was capable of. Then he put his hat on and left. Francis, who had stood through the entire meeting with the composed attention of someone archiving information, waited until Clayton's footsteps were out the door and then said quietly to Adeline, "Your mother would have found that immensely satisfying." Adeline looked at her aunt. The tightness in her jaw that had been present since the documents on the kitchen table had been there, off and on, for 2 days. It loosened now, just slightly. "She would have told me I talked too fast," Adeline said. "You did talk a little fast," Francis said. Silas said nothing. He was looking at his wife and feeling something that he did not yet have the right word for, though it was in the direction of astonished and not far from proud, and also had a sharp edge to it that was something like fear. The fear of wanting something so much that the possibility of losing it becomes physically uncomfortable. Ruth Calloway materialized at his left elbow. She had a talent for that. "Silas Boone," she said, looking straight ahead, "that woman is smarter than you." "I know," he said. "Good," Ruth said, "as long as you know." She walked away. Silas and Adeline and Francis walked out into the May morning, which was, as Silas had promised, genuinely good. Blue sky over the mountains, the mud finally firming up, the smell of things starting to grow. Francis left on Tuesday. She stood by her hired coach with her satchel and her Philadelphia coat, and she looked at Adeline for a long moment, and then she did something that seemed to cost her some effort. She reached out and put a hand on Adeline's face. "She was right about you," Francis said. Adeline covered her aunt's hand with her own for a moment. Then Francis got in the coach, and it turned down the track, and they watched until the trees took it. Adeline stood with her hands at her sides looking down the empty track. "You all right?" Silas said. "Yes." A pause. "She cried in the back room last night. I heard her through the wall." Another pause. "I don't think she knew I could hear." He didn't say anything. "She's going back to an empty city and a lot of paperwork," Adeline said. "That seems worse than what I'm going back to." "What are you going back to?" She looked at him sideways. "A fence line and a heifer that keeps finding the gap. We fixed that gap in February. She found a new one, Tuesday." He almost smiled. "Why didn't you say?" "I was handling it." "That," he said, "is the least useful sentence in any language." She stared at him for a full second, then she laughed, the real laugh, the unguarded one. and he stood in the May morning listening to it and felt the fear he'd been carrying since December quietly, incrementally, make room for something else. They fixed the gap that afternoon, both of them, the heifer watching them from 20 feet away with an air of speculative interest. The letter from Philadelphia, the money, the house, the life she could have returned to, stayed on the shelf where Adeline had put it. Neither of them discussed it in concrete terms, but Silas was aware of it the way you're aware of weather coming, not with dread, but with the honest knowledge that it would arrive in its own time and require something of both of them. He thought about it one evening in late May while he was out at the barn after supper, doing the end-of-day tasks alone the way he'd done them for years. The lantern put a warm circle of light on the stall boards, and Cobb was investigating something in the corner, and the horses were settled and quiet. He thought about what Adeline had said on the hill. "I'm keeping it." The promise to her mother, a man whose character couldn't be bought. He thought about himself, honestly, the way you can only do it in a barn at night with no audience. He was not sure he'd earned that description. He was stubborn and bad at asking for help, and he'd spent 8 years becoming someone who expected very little, because expecting very little was the only arithmetic that never left you short. He wasn't educated. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have Clayton Hurst's voice or Tom Greeley's easy friendliness or the particular grace of men who move through the world without bracing against it. What he had was this. He meant what he said. He did what he said he would do. He did not take things that weren't his. When the work was hard, he did it anyway, and when he didn't know how, he found out. He sat with that for a while, not sure if it was enough or just the best he had. Then Cobb finished investigating the corner and came and pressed his head against Silas's knee, and Silas put a hand on the dog's head and sat in the quiet barn, and after a while he blew out the lantern and went back inside. Adeline was at the table writing a letter. She glanced up when he came in. "Francis?" he asked. "The solicitor in Philadelphia," she said. "About the house." She looked at the page and then at him. "I'm going to rent it, not sell it yet." She paused. "Is that—" "It's your property," he said. "I know it is. I'm asking how you feel about it." He sat down across from her. She waited, pen in hand, and he appreciated, not for the first time, that she let him take the time he needed rather than filling the space to make herself feel better. "I think it's wise," he said. "Selling it decides things in a direction that can't be undone. Renting it keeps options open. You shouldn't close options unnecessarily." She looked at him. "Even options that go away from here?" "Even those," he said, and meant it, and she could tell he meant it, and something in her expression softened in a way that was visible only briefly before she looked back at her letter. "You know I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You might want to one day," he said. "I'd rather you'd kept the option." She wrote 2 more lines, then she set the pen down and looked up. "Silas Boone," she said, "you are the most inconveniently decent man I have ever encountered." He didn't know what to say to that. "That was a compliment," she said. "I figured," he said. "I just didn't have an answer for it." She picked up the pen again. He watched her write for a few minutes and then went to bed, and somewhere between the ceiling and sleep he decided that whatever came next, the money, the house, Clayton's next move, the fence post still needed on the west line, the roof corner that held for now but wouldn't forever. Whatever came next, he would handle it the same way he'd handled everything since December. One morning at a time, with someone beside him who'd chosen to be there. He fell asleep without fighting it, which was new. Outside, the May night was clear and cold at the edges, but not brutal, and the stars over the Montana ridge were the particular extravagant kind that only show themselves this far from any light. And the creek that Clayton Hurst had tried 3 different ways to get his hands on ran the way it always did, in the dark, over its own smooth stones, going where it was going, unbothered by anyone's plans for it. That creek, Silas had always felt, knew something. He wasn't sure what, but it knew something. And in the morning, there would be work. There was always work. But tonight, in the cabin on the western slope, with the letter to the Philadelphia solicitor sealed and sitting beside the door, and Cobb turning 3 circles on his rug and settling, and the stove speaking in its low nightly language, tonight, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. Just enough. And that Silas had lived long enough to know was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. The flood came without the warning everyone said it would give. There had been signs, in the way there are always signs that people read correctly only afterward. The snowpack on the northern ridge had been abnormally heavy all winter. Silas had noted it in February and said nothing because there was nothing to be done about snow that hadn't melted yet. The spring thaw had come 2 weeks late and then arrived all at once, the way a decision does when it's been delayed too long. 3 days of warm rain on top of saturated ground on top of a ridge that had been holding more water than it had any right to hold. On the 4th day, the ridge stopped holding it. Silas heard it before he saw it, a sound like the land itself clearing its throat, low and continuous and wrong, coming from the north at 4 in the morning while he was already up because the rain on the roof had changed pitch sometime after 3 and his body knew the difference between ordinary rain and rain with intent. He was out the door before he'd finished thinking. The creek that Clayton Hurst had tried 3 separate ways to acquire had become something that no longer deserved the word creek. It had consumed its own banks and was moving across the lower pasture in a dark, fast sheet that caught the early gray light and held no reflection. The fence posts he and Adeline had replaced in February were already gone. The water was moving south and east and taking things with it. Brush, a section of the old gate, what looked like a piece of someone's outbuilding from further up the valley. He went back inside. Adeline was already dressed. She was pulling on her boots at the kitchen table, and she looked up when he came in and read his face the way she'd learned to in 6 months of reading A Man Who Didn't Waste Words. "How bad?" she said. "Bad," he said. "The Hendersons' lower field will be underwater by sunup. Kellerman's barn is in the floodplain. The Kellermans have 3 children." "I know." He was already getting his coat. "I'm going to ride north, find out who needs—" "I'll take the wagon south to the Hendersons," she said, not asking. He stopped, looked at her. The particular calculus of a man who wants to say it's not safe to a woman he has watched fix a roof in the rain, set fence posts in frozen ground, and take apart a cattle baron's legal proposal in front of 20 ranchers. "The track to Henderson's will be soft," he said. "Stay on the ridge line, not the low road." "I know," she said. "Go." He went. What happened in the next 14 hours was not heroic in the way stories make things heroic, clean and purposeful and moving in one direction. It was chaotic and cold, and nothing went the way it was supposed to, and Silas made at least 2 decisions that he second-guessed while making them, and one that he knew was dangerous before he finished making it and made it anyway. The first was crossing the lower bridge on his way to the Kellerman place. The bridge was a single-span timber crossing over what had been, 3 days ago, a mild tributary. It was now a fast, opaque run of brown water carrying debris at a speed that made the bridge's remaining lifespan a matter of active debate. He could see it flexing. He could hear the timber working against the crossbeams. He crossed it anyway because the Kellermans were on the other side. The horse didn't want to go. He gave it credit for that. He pushed it forward with his legs and kept his weight centered and didn't look at the water, and they made it across in the time it took him to breathe twice, and behind him he heard the bridge give a deep structural groan that he chose not to interpret. He didn't look back. The Kellerman homestead was on high enough ground that the house itself was untouched, but Dan Kellerman's barn was ankle-deep and rising, and his cattle, 11 head, were bunched against the far fence of the upper pasture with the whites of their eyes showing. Dan was already in the water trying to open a gate that had swelled shut from the moisture, and his wife Martha was on the porch with the youngest child on her hip, watching her husband with the expression of someone trying to calculate how far away help was. Silas dismounted and went into the water without stopping. "Gate's jammed," Dan said. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, and the frustration in his voice had the compressed quality of someone who had been fighting this particular problem for 20 minutes. Silas looked at the gate. The problem wasn't the latch. The whole frame had swollen and shifted. He went back to the horse, got the rope, tied one end around the gate post and the other around the saddle horn, and put the horse to work. The gate came out of the frame with a sound like a gunshot and fell into the water, and the cattle moved through the gap with the dumb, grateful urgency of animals that had been frightened for a long time. "Where are they going?" Dan said. "Higher ground. Follow them." Silas untied the rope. "Can you get the family to the Pierce place? It's above the water line." "Martha won't leave the—" "Dan." Silas looked at him directly. The bridge on the lower crossing won't last another 2 hours. If it goes while you're on this side, you're here until the water drops, and that's 3-4 days minimum. Dan looked at the barn, looked at his house, the arithmetic of a man counting what he might lose against what he couldn't afford to. "I'll get Martha," he said. Silas moved on. He rode the ridgeline west, which added distance but kept him on ground that wasn't actively trying to become a riverbed. And he stopped at 2 more homesteads. The Aldrich place, which was already evacuated, the family having read the signs earlier than most. And the Varga operation, where old Henrik Varga was 73 and living alone, and had apparently decided that floodwater was a problem for younger men. Silas found him in his kitchen eating breakfast with 4 inches of water on the floor. "Henrik," Silas said from the doorway. "We're going." Henrik looked up. "I've seen floods." "Not this one." Silas looked at the water level against the doorframe, which had been maybe 2 inches when he arrived and was now closer to 4. "I'm not asking." Henrik looked at him for a long moment, with the dignity of a man who had been making his own decisions for 73 years and was not accustomed to being told otherwise. Then he pushed back his chair and stood up. "Let me get my boots." "They're already wet," Silas said. "Let me get my boots anyway," Henrik said, and he got them, and they left. By mid-morning, Silas had a loose count of who was accounted for and who wasn't. The ones he couldn't place were the Bauer family. Recent arrivals, a year in the valley, their homestead on the far eastern edge of the floodplain where nobody had built before because the old-timers knew better and the Bauers hadn't known to ask. He'd heard there were 4 of them, maybe 5, if the wife had delivered the baby that had been due in April. He pointed his horse east. The lower road to the Bauer place was gone. Not flooded, gone. The bank undercut and collapsed into the water, a clean drop of 4 feet where a road had been that morning. He went north, found a slope he could descend, came into the floodplain from a different angle and pushed through water that reached the horse's belly before shallowing out on a rise that put him within sight of the Bauer homestead. The house was on a small, natural elevation, which was the only reason it still existed. The water was at the foundation on 3 sides, and the door was open, and a woman, young, 20-something, with the particular exhausted look of someone who had given birth recently and then been told the world was flooding, was standing on the porch holding an infant and watching the water with an expression that had moved past panic into a kind of numb focus. A man who must have been her husband appeared behind her. He saw Silas, and something in his posture collapsed with relief. "We've been here since 2 this morning," the man said. "Jacob Bauer. This is my wife, Liesel. The baby came 3 weeks ago, and we couldn't move fast." "You moved exactly right," Silas said. "You stayed high, and you stayed together." He looked at the water between them and the rise he'd come in from. "I need you to trust me on the route out. It's not how you'd go normally." Jacob looked at his wife. She was already moving, adjusting the baby against her chest, nodding once at her husband. "Tell us where to walk," she said. They made it out. It was slow and cold, and the baby cried the entire time, and Liesel Bauer did not cry once, which Silas thought about later as one of the more quietly remarkable things he'd seen in a day of remarkable things. They came out on the ridge road an hour later, and Ruth Calloway was there. Ruth, who had apparently appointed herself the coordination point for the valley's displaced families, with a wagon full of blankets and the kind of competent authority that disasters revealed in certain people. And she took one look at Liesel and the baby and said, "Get in the wagon," with such certainty that there was nothing to do but obey. "Adeline?" Silas said to Ruth. "Henderson family is at the Pierce place," Ruth said. "She got them out before the lower field went under. She's been going back and forth, supplies, blankets, the Henderson livestock." Ruth paused. "She moved 12 head of cattle by herself in the dark, Silas. 12. He stood with that. "Also," Ruth said, "she organized the women at the Pierce place into a cooking operation that has produced more food in 6 hours than that house typically sees in a month. Francis would be horrified." "Francis went back to Philadelphia," Silas said. "Then Francis is missing a story," Ruth said, and clicked at her horse. "He found Adeline at the Pierce farm at 3 in the afternoon. He came in from the north road and she was in the yard, her coat dark with water from the waist down, her hair coming out of its braid, directing two of the Pierce boys in the securing of a gate that was in danger of being pushed open by the heifer that had spent all spring finding gaps in fences and had apparently brought her talent to the emergency. She saw him and her shoulders dropped exactly 1 inch, the specific release of someone who has been holding a thing together and has just been told they can share the weight. "You're all right," she said. "I'm all right," he said. She looked him over the way she'd looked at his hand in February, assessing, not consoling, satisfied with the inventory. Then she went back to the gate. "The Bowers?" she said. "Safe. Ruth has them." "The bridge on the lower crossing collapsed about an hour ago," she said. "Tom Greeley saw it go. No one was on it." He thought of the groan he'd heard behind him that morning and said nothing. "Henrik Varga is inside eating his second bowl of soup and telling anyone who will listen that he's seen worse," Adeline said. "He probably has," Silas said. "He hasn't," she said. "Ruth told me. This is the worst flood in 23 years. She looked at the heifer, who had given up on the gate and was staring at her with bovine resentment. "But he needed to say it, so let him say it." The water began dropping on the second day, and was substantially receded by the third, leaving behind the particular wreckage of a flood, the mud, the displaced debris, the things that had been somewhere and were now somewhere else or nowhere at all. The lower pasture on the Boone spread had lost 6 fence posts and a section of the water trough. The lean-to on the east side of the barn, which Silas and Adeline had secured in February, held. The roof corner he'd properly repaired in May held. The creek parcel, the land Clayton Hurst had tried 3 ways to acquire, the land with the water access that everyone now understood the value of, had managed the flood surge better than most of the valley because the creek bed was clean and the banks were maintained, and Silas had spent 2 autumns clearing the brush that would have snagged debris and backed the water up. Nobody mentioned that out loud. Not right away. But people noticed. That was how things worked in small valleys. Nobody made speeches, but nobody forgot either. The cleanup took 2 weeks. It was the kind of work that happens when a community does what communities do at their best, which is show up without being asked and do whatever needs doing without making it a performance. The Pierce boys helped rebuild the Bower fence. Dan Kellerman and 2 of his cousins spent a day on the Boone spread resetting the water trough because Silas had gotten them out before the bridge went, and there was no other way Dan knew how to say thank you. Henrik Varga, who was 73 and had been eating soup in someone else's kitchen for 3 days, showed up on the 4th morning with tools and worked until noon before Ruth made him stop, which he did under protest. Ruth herself coordinated everything from the back of her wagon with the organizational certainty of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a situation large enough to require her full capacity. Clayton Hurst sent a note offering financial assistance with flood recovery efforts to be administered through his consortium structure. Ruth read it to the assembled group at the Pierce farm and then folded it and put it in her coat pocket and said, "We'll note the offer," and moved on, and that was that. What happened with Clayton Hurst in the weeks that followed was not dramatic. That was perhaps what Silas appreciated most about it. There was no confrontation, no final scene. The consortium proposal, already weakened by what Adeline had done at Miller's Hardware, lost the last of its momentum when 3 of the families Clayton had counted as committed quietly declined to formalize their participation. Nobody cited Adeline's analysis directly, but 3 families had been in that room at Miller's Hardware, and their wives had been at the Pierce farm during the flood, and one of those wives had watched Adeline Boone wade into water past her knees to get a family's cattle to high ground before the field went under. People drew their own conclusions. Clayton pulled back from the valley that summer, spending more time in the county seat and less time on the eastern ridge. Whether he was licking wounds or simply recalculating was a question Silas didn't spend much energy on. He'd spent enough of his life tracking what Clayton Hurst was doing. He had better things to track now. The summer settled into something Silas would have had trouble describing to his December self. The version of him who had driven 14 miles to a train station and stood on a frozen platform certain he was about to meet someone who would take one look at his life and make a polite excuse. The days were long and full of work, and Adeline was in most of them. Not all. She still had her Sunday mornings on the hill, And Silas still gave her those without comment, because some things belong to a person, and the right move was to leave them there. But the rest of the day, she was present in the way that someone becomes present when they have actually decided to be somewhere. Not performing presence, but simply being it. At the fence line, at the kitchen table, in the barn at odd hours talking to Cobb about things Silas couldn't hear but could see were serious conversations by Cobb's attentive expression. He found himself, somewhere in June, doing something he hadn't done in years, planning past the immediate season. Not just next month's feed order, but the following spring's grazing rotation. The roof repair that would need to happen in fall before winter, done properly this time with two people who knew what they were doing. A second water trough on the north pasture that would have prevented the loss during the flood, and which he had the materials and the time, and, this was the part that was new, the reasonable expectation that he would still be here to use it. That expectation was not something he'd had before. He'd operated for 8 years on a kind of permanent provisional basis, maintaining the ranch the way a person maintains something they're not sure they'll keep, doing what was immediately necessary and deferring everything else. He hadn't known that was what he was doing until it stopped. The letter came from Philadelphia in July. The house had been rented. A family, Adeline told him, which she was glad about because she liked the idea of the rooms being loud. The income would go into an account in her name. She told him all of this at breakfast in the same practical tone she used for everything practical. "And the account?" he asked. She looked at him across the table. "What about it?" "Is it—" He stopped. He was not good at these conversations, and he knew it, and she knew it, and she usually waited him out with the patience of someone who understood that he got there eventually. "I don't want you to feel like you need permission to use your own money." "I don't feel that," she said. "Is that what you were trying to ask?" "I'm not sure what I was trying to ask," he said honestly. She poured him more coffee. "I was thinking," she said, "about the north pasture trough." He looked up. "The materials are sitting in the barn," she said. "We have the time before the fall work starts. And there's enough from the first month's rent to cover the pipe fitting we're short on." She looked at him. "Unless you had other plans for it." "That's your money," he said. "We established that. I'm choosing to put it toward the trough." She set the coffee pot down. "Silas, this is not a complicated conversation. It only becomes one if we let it." He sat with that. She was right. She was frequently right, and she delivered it without triumph, which he'd come to appreciate as one of her more underrated qualities. "The pipe fitting," he said. "We'd need the 3/4-inch couplings. Miller's will have them." "I'll add them to the supply list," she said, and picked up her pen. They built the trough in August, both of them, over 4 days of intermittent work around the other demands of the season. It was not elegant. The post alignment was slightly off on the east end, and the inlet valve took 3 adjustments to stop dripping. But it held water, and it was real, and it was there, on the north pasture, a permanent thing they had built together. And when the cattle started using it, Adeline stood at the fence and watched them with an expression of entirely uncomplicated satisfaction. "It works," she said. "It works," he agreed. She looked at him sideways. "You sound surprised." "I'm not. I just like hearing it." She smiled. Not the small controlled version, not the almost smile, but the real one. And she looked back at the cattle, and Silas looked at the side of her face in the August light and felt the full accumulated weight of the past 8 months. The letters, the platform, the cabin, the hill, the flood, the consortium, the kitchen window and the cornbread, and the cold nights, and the lean-to, and all the fence posts and all the mornings, and understood, finally and without drama, that he had not been waiting for a richer life. He had been waiting for one that meant something, and he had not known the difference until she showed him. He didn't say any of that. He was not built for speeches, and she would have looked at him with concern if he'd attempted one. What he said was, "Ruth's coming Thursday." "I know. I invited her." "You invited Ruth?" "I wanted to tell her about the trough." Adeline unhooked her arms from the fence rail and turned toward the cabin. "Also, she's lonely, and she pretends not to be. And sometimes the right thing to do is not wait to be asked." He watched her walk toward the cabin, her even, practical stride, her braid coming slightly loose in the back the way it always did by afternoon. And he thought about loneliness, the particular kind that a person stops recognizing as loneliness because it becomes indistinguishable from normal life. He'd been inside it for so long that he'd accepted it as climate. Not a condition, but a fact, like winter, like the altitude. He hadn't known you could be argued out of it. He hadn't known a woman could arrive on a train in December and build a window repair and a Sunday promise and 12 cattle in the dark into something that restructured the whole interior of a man without either of them announcing that was what was happening. He thought about what Ruth had said to him at Miller's Hardware in May. "She's smarter than you?" And his own answer, "I know." That wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was more like she was different than him in the specific ways that had made him better without making him less himself. She hadn't tried to change what he was. She had just occupied the same space and chosen it, and that had been enough to shift something fundamental. He didn't know if that was what love looked like for everyone. He suspected it looked different in different hands, but he knew what it felt like for a man like him. Not a sudden arrival, but a slow, undeniable accumulation. Coffee in the dark, a repaired gate, a letter on a shelf, a woman on a hill keeping a promise to someone she missed. You didn't light up for that the way people did in stories. You just became, slowly, someone who couldn't imagine the room without her in it. Ruth came Thursday and stayed for supper and talked about the flood and the Bauer baby and Henrik Varga's insistence that he'd seen worse. And Adeline made a soup that was better than anything Ruth had produced in 62 years of cooking, which Ruth admitted with a specificity that made it clearly painful, and Cobb ate 3 dropped pieces of bread and retired to the rug with a dignity that the quantity of bread perhaps did not merit. When Ruth left, later than she usually stayed, she stood at the door with her coat on and looked at the two of them, and she said, "You'll do." Not to either of them specifically, to both of them. To the thing they had made in this cabin in the space between December and now. After she left, Silas washed the dishes because Adeline had cooked, and that was how they'd divided it since February without ever discussing it. And she sat at the table with a cup of tea and the household ledger she kept, a thing she had started in January and which was more organized than anything Silas had produced in 8 years of approximate record-keeping. And the lantern made its usual warm circle on the table, and the stove made its usual language, and Cobb breathed on the rug. Adeline looked up from the ledger. "The grazing income this season is up 14% from last year," she said. "The rainfall was good," he said. "The rainfall was good, and we adjusted the rotation in April," she said. "Both things." He dried the last cup. "Both things," he agreed. She went back to the ledger. He hung up the dishcloth. He sat down across from her, and she didn't look up, but she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, the way you do when there's nothing to say that the gesture doesn't say better. Then she took her hand back and wrote a number in the ledger and said, "We should put the south fence before winter." "After the trough valve," he said. "The valve is done," she said. "It's still dripping." "It's dripping 4 drops a minute," she said. "It's done enough." He thought about arguing and decided against it. "South fence," he said. "September." "September," she agreed. He looked at her bent over the ledger in the lamplight, her pen moving, her hair loose now from its braid because she'd taken it down after Ruth left in the way she did every evening. And he thought, 8 years of driving home to a dark cabin and a dog who was glad to see him and nothing else. And he had genuinely believed that was the shape of things, that some people simply got less, that wanting more was a kind of greed he had no right to. He had been wrong about that. He'd been wrong in the specific way that a person is wrong when they've been alone long enough to confuse the walls they've built with the walls that actually exist. The walls that actually exist are fewer than you think. The ones you build yourself are not load-bearing, no matter how solid they feel. He had not known that. He knew it now. Outside, the Montana summer was doing what it did in August, burning gold and vast and slightly too much of everything at once, the kind of extravagance that made you forgive it all the other months. The North Pasture trough caught the last of the evening light and held it for a moment before the sun dropped behind the ridge, and the light went the way light does, without ceremony. Inside the cabin, the ledger was annotated, and the dishes were clean, and the stove was banked for the night, and Cobb was already asleep. Silas Boone sat across from his wife and looked at the life he had not been expecting and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Some things you just carry, quietly, gratefully, for the rest of whatever you're given.